that's where the comparison with the EU referendum and with Brexit matters, because even you can have a capitalist economy without people who believe in capitalism, because once you have it, it's just quite hard to change. But then that is precisely what supporters of Britain's EU membership would have said before 2016. They would have said, yes, we know that Britain is not a country of Europhiles. We know that this is not a country of people who are enthusiastic about the European project in the way that some of the core members, such as Belgium or Luxembourg, may be. We know that, but we nonetheless believe, that was the argument, we nonetheless believe that it doesn't matter, because being anti-EU is something that people just say. It's just idle talk, and that you don't need a deep commitment, that you just have the status quo bias, and that would be enough to make sure that Britain will always be in the EU. And as we now know, that isn't how it turned out. And a capitalism without capitalists would be like an EU member without Europhiles.
Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK with me, Darren Grimes, where the channel asks you to think more and follow less, and boy oh boy do we need to get our thinking caps on for this problem. The London-based think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, has commissioned an extensive survey into the economic attitudes of millennials and Zoomers, i.e. Generation Z, which suggests the Conservative Party had better not get too comfortable with its 80-seat majority anytime soon, if the next generation is anything to go by. One shocking stat from the survey reveals that a whopping 67% of younger people say they would like to live in a socialist economic system. Now this, to me, highlights the really pressing need of the Conservative Party to actually do something about the housing crisis, because one line that I've heard parroted time and time again is from younger people especially: why would you be pro-capitalism when you don't have any capital or the ability to acquire any capital? Joining me to discuss the important findings is Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Hi, Kristian.
Hello, Darren.
Now, Kristian, why did you commission this survey, and what, in your eyes, are some of the most important findings from it? Because I must preface this first question by saying I don't think, Kristian, you're one of life's optimists. Knowing you as I do, I don't think you are.
Absolutely not, no.
So I assume this has made you even less optimistic for our future.
It was more or less what I expected, to be honest. The reason why we commissioned this is that, well, I've been having these arguments for years about the return of socialism as a mainstream ideology, and how anti-capitalism became hegemonic, at least in certain age groups. But what I wanted to know is how widespread is this really? Because a lot of the time people on the pro-market side of the argument have been telling me, you're too pessimistic. Don't worry about this. This is just a Twitter phenomenon. This is just the little online left-wing bubble. This is the left-wing echo chamber of social media. But real people out there in the real world don't think like that at all. Now, I've always been somewhat skeptical of that claim, because it is, of course, true that that Twitter is unrepresentative of the general population, in the sense that most people aren't very political. Twitter users are mostly politics obsessives, or at least people on political Twitter. In that sense, it's unrepresentative, but it's true in many areas of life that you have a dedicated minority that sets the tone, because they're much more interested in the topic, whatever it is. Can be fashion, can be culinary tastes, can be anything. You often have a dedicated minority that sets the tone, and lots of people who are just not that interested in the subject, and who just more or less go along with what the trendsetters and the early adopters are saying. And my suspicion was that the realm of political ideas is like that too. That yes, you have some people who are thinking about these issues all the time, to the point of being obsessed with it, and then most people consider that slightly weird and are not nearly as interested in that. But that doesn't mean that they think completely differently. It could also mean that you have these politics obsessives as trendsetters, and the rest more or less repeats what they say with less dedication. And that's what I wanted to find out with this poll. So what we did, quite simply, is we put some of the anti-capitalist slogans that you would hear from organizations such as Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, Momentum. We put those positions in front of the people we polled and asked them, do you agree with this? Or do you strongly agree? Do you disagree, strongly disagree? And the short summary is that whenever you present an anti-capitalist position to a younger audience, you always get between 70 and 80% agreeing with it. A lot of them strongly agreeing, but if you put together the strongly agree and just agree, if you add them up, you always get a figure between 70 and 80% for some quite banal, tried anti-capitalist cliches, things like capitalism is to blame for climate change, or capitalism fuels racism, capitalism makes us greedy, selfish, materialistic, the Twitter opinions, you would say, the thing where people would normally tell me, this is only Twitter. The poll shows, no, in that regard, Twitter really is real life. Twitter is the real world.
So then, thinking about this polling in particular, at what age did you find out at what age you have to be these days to not have pro-socialist views? As in, when is the cutoff point? Because the trope is, isn't it? The argument is that the older you get, the less likely you are to, vote for the left.
Yes, that's right. And that is one of the perceptions I wanted to counter with this. And I think the polling and my report does counter that quite effectively. The idea that left-wing ideas, anti-capitalist ideas, is something that only young people go through and that you automatically grow out of it. I didn't find the cutoff poll in our own polling because we only went up to the mid-30s. In hindsight, I regretted that a bit. In hindsight, I thought we should have gone higher. We should have gone maybe to mid-40s. I don't find any cutoff point yet in our data up to mid-30s. I've therefore also looked at older surveys. By older, I mean from the past 5 years, still recent, where they asked similar questions such as, do you agree with the statement, communism could have worked if it had been better implemented, stuff like that. And it's usually even people in their early 40s still agree with that. If there's no cutoff point as such, but it starts to decline from then on. However, that doesn't mean that today's young people will also give up on those ideas if by the time they reach their mid-40s or wherever that is. Because I'd say this idea that you grow out of certain ideas, that's something which only makes sense if you're talking about very young people. If you had lots of 20-year-old socialists, but very few 30-year-old socialists, then I would say it's completely fair to say, yes, these people will, this is just an effect of age. Give these people 10 years and by then they will have abandoned those ideas. However, if people in their 40s, if 40-year-olds still agree very much with socialism, you can't apply that logic of growing out of it anymore.
What do you think then explains this? Because I wonder to what extent an experience of what would be perceived market failures, and by that I mean I assume the commuter belt into London, rail, for example, would be viewed as a market failure. They would argue, and I assume your position, Kristian, would be that actually privatisation of the railway was a complete botched job, and that it didn't, it never was essentially a fully private network. But the argument would be that, hang on a minute, when I've experienced these market failures in housing, whenever I've experienced these market failures in rail, the only, I think, market success I can think of off the top of my head, and this is me assuming what young people are thinking, would be in telecommunications, for example. And when you wonder or believe that you'll never be able to accrue any capital for yourself. It goes back to that point I made at the start. Why would you be a capitalist?
Yes, I think a lot of this is driven by economic factors of that sort, and especially by the housing crisis. Because yes, for most people, that is their most important interaction with the market economy. That is you in your role as a private renter. You realize that you pay half of your income, or sometimes more, to live in what is quite often, at least in the expensive parts of the country, a substandard home. And I think what happens is that people then generalize from that experience. They associate that negative experience that they have in their role as private renters with capitalism, with the market, and then extrapolate. They then think, this is what capitalism is like. If that's what capitalism means, then I'm against it. Then I don't like it. But I would also say that sometimes people can go through the same experiences and draw completely different conclusions from them. So I say there's nothing automatic in having a bad experience as a tenant. That doesn't automatically make you anti-capitalists. I had the same experiences when I moved to London 14 years ago. That was the first thing that I noticed about London was that the housing market is completely dysfunctional, and lived in some horrible places that were still super expensive. But my first question wasn't why is capitalism failing me, because I had moved here from a place which was also capitalist and which didn't have those problems, and therefore my first question was what's going on the supply side here? Why do other cities manage to provide enough housing and London doesn't? So people could also draw that conclusion. The reason why they don't is I think that there is an anti-capitalist mood which is already there, and once that mood is there, every negative experience that you go through, you would then attribute it to capitalism, because that would just be the general starting point.
And I wonder what then, you accrue a certain level of social capital if you espouse views which would be, you could coin a phrase, virtue signalling is what you might call it. And you get that social capital by saying, well, this thing happened to me, or this thing happened and it was disgusting, it is capitalism's fault, I'm literally a communist, Kristian. You can say that on national television these days, and instead of being booed and jeered, you'll get a round of applause for doing so. You wouldn't have been able to do that back in the days even probably of, when I was born in the 90s. It would have been a bit, ooh, hang on a minute. When we consider that, do you think, Kristian, that social media actually plays a big part in making socialism, or what people would deem to be socialism? Because I'm not sure that they actually, and I don't mean this to sound patronising, but I'm not sure most people out there, every Tom, Dick and Harry, knows what socialism is in practice. They just think, oh, well, doing things for the everyman, basically, those who can't pay don't pay. Great, that sounds fantastic. Of course it does in principle. So do you think actually social media is playing a big part in driving this, sort of through the woke and progressive movement?
Yes, I do think that, and that's why it's a mistake to dismiss social media as a bubble. That at least in Britain, that is not true. Britain has one of the highest rates of social media usage, or certainly of Twitter usage. I can't remember the exact figures, but I've looked at figures which showed you the number of Twitter users by country, and Britain has about as many Twitter users as Brazil and India, countries with much larger populations.
Wow, yeah.
Compared to population size, Britain is one of the countries that are most active on social media. So this isn't something that only a politically hyperactive minority engages in. Of course, you would have a politically hyperactive minority would be the people who who sent most tweets. It would be highly unequal in that sense. You would have a few people who are Twitter obsessives, like you and me, who use it all the time, and many who just log on occasionally, or who just retweet content without generating their own content. But nonetheless, you have a lot of people who observe Twitter debates, even if it's only passive. And in that regard, Britain is somewhat unusual in that you have a lot more people who use social media. And there it is absolutely true that you gain points by expressing left-wing cliches. Those are always the ideas that get the largest numbers of likes and retweets. And there is just then a temptation to say things that are popular, that people realize, this gets me rewards. This is the sort of stuff that I have to say. This is the fashionable opinion. And yes, that is a form of virtue signaling, although there we have to clarify what that means. Quite often when you say somebody is virtue signaling, it comes across as though you're accusing someone of faking beliefs, of saying something just to get the social rewards, the social approval that you get for that. I don't think this is really how it works. I think in a lot of cases, people just feel drawn to views that they see are popular. That makes you sympathetic, and then you grow into it. You say it yourself, and you realize that you get positive reactions, and you convince yourself that that is what you truly believe. But it's not that doesn't mean that you're faking anything. You just grow into that, and we're just drawn to fashionable opinions.
Your survey also, I think, puts to bed the myth of the apathetic millennial, right? Because I can remember during the EU referendum, one of the most patronising slogans and ad campaigns I think I've ever seen produced in my political lifetime came out of that campaign. You know, it was like chillin', voting and stuff like that. And I think even as recent as 2016, I recall it being said that young people just simply aren't engaged politically and are incredibly apathetic. Does your research find that that is true?
No, it doesn't. But it was probably true up until that point. Around that time, we saw the turning point. It was
so it's
true
Jeremy Corbyn. Is that who saved the millennial movement?
Yes. Well, or slightly earlier. It was the chant was Glastonbury 2017. There was the Corbyn mania when he was just running for Labour leader, or when it became clear that he would become Labour leader.
Of course, momentum was born then.
Exactly, yes. Or I would even say there is a precursor to that, which was the Russell Brand movement, whatever you want to call that, when he published his book, and which was a sort of primitive communism of sorts that he was endorsing there. That was, I think, a year or two before the start of Corbyn mania. But yeah, you had several steps leading up to that. And the change with Corbyn mania was that before then, there were these anti-capitalist movements. There was Occupy Wall Street and so on. But there was always a perception that this is a small and active minority. And then when Corbyn came along and you had this outbreak of enthusiasm, it suddenly became clear that this isn't just a few thousand people. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. That this is a movement with which you can fill large venues and town halls and market squares. And that this is a big thing, and this radiates outwards and affects people who may not be hugely political. So that's when this perception of the apathetic millennial began to crumble. And of course, then you had movements like Extinction Rebellion, the Greta Thunberg movement, Black Lives Matter, which are mass movements and which are mostly youth movements. And then you had the outbreak of the culture war. Initially, it was just a campus culture war. It was seen as something that's limited to the university campus. It quickly became mainstream, that you had the no platforming and the Great Awakening, as it's now called, and the rise of cancel culture and all that. And that is just hard to square with the idea that young people are apathetic. You can either describe them as woke culture warriors or as apathetic, but not both. And the latter one replaced the apathy perception.
How responsible is Tony Blair's target of getting 50% of young people in universities? Because is it just a failure, or at least in my opinion, a failure of education? Because we're the most educated millennials are the most educated generation on paper, yet your survey finds that, you know, many of us don't actually know the difference between socialism and capitalism. So what's going on there? Can't be that educated, surely.
Yes, I think the extension of higher education, and more generally that people, whatever their precise educational career, just spend more time in full-time education. I think that is a part of it. How big, I can't say. In that report, I can only show what people currently think, not what causes that, what led them to that place. But it is at least plausible that or let's put it that way, in a lot of the right-wing media, you often see the claim that schools and universities are left-wing indoctrination factories. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily buy that, because there's also quite a bit of evidence that teachers and professors don't actually have that much of an impact on people's thinking. That either because they're quite bad at trying to sell their viewpoints, or because their students discount it and take it with a pinch of salt when they know that their teacher, professor has a particular viewpoint. So I don't think it's necessarily that. But if you spend a much greater proportion of your formative years in full-time education, that also means that you spend more time around people of your age. Whereas in previous generations, people might have entered the workplace earlier, and a workplace would be more of a mixed generation setting. You have people of various ages, and in a normal workplace, unless you work in Westminster, in a normal workplace, people wouldn't necessarily talk about politics a lot. It might be something that you try to actively keep out of the workplace, because you know that it's divisive. Whereas if you are among people your age the whole time, then of course you talk about politics in the broadest sense. It doesn't have to mean party politics, but certainly about things like the issues that groups like Extinction Rebellion and the Greta Thunberg movement are talking about. The cancellation of unwoke opinions. Those are things that you would talk about with people your age, and it just means people spend a lot more time in a peer group that is political and where people judge each other by their views, and where you wouldn't so easily get away with being the dissenter, the odd one out, the one who has the unfashionable opinions. And if that is then combined with people spending more time on social media, where you have the same effect except permanent, you have that woke, progressive, socialist peer group, except it's there all the time. You can log in from anywhere and all the time. Then that effect is around you all the time. I can't say how big that the impact of that is, but I would be very surprised if it had zero impact. If you just compared it to my time when I was an undergraduate, social media didn't exist yet. There were internet forums where you could discuss politics, but that would be something where you have to quite deliberately log in and set aside maybe half an hour thinking, now I'm going to argue about politics, but it wasn't something that was permanently with you. Whereas now, I do most of my tweeting nowadays from London Underground. You can be literally anywhere, and it just doesn't leave you. And you have these peer groups around you all the time. That must have some impact on people's thinking.
Very interesting. I mean, I assume, given that you follow, I know you follow these sort of accounts quite often, especially whereas Twitter's concerned, younger, trendy millennials, trendy socialist millennials, trendy Marxist millennials, trendy even communist millennials, self-described, self-professed communist millennials, They would argue, Kristian, and I know you know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, but they would argue that in 2017, of course, Jeremy Corbyn almost won the election against Theresa May. They would argue that actually it's not Sir Keir Starmer or a so-called moderate candidate that's the alternative in Britain. It should be someone of the left, like Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist, who actually will cut through. And when you look at the evidence, and you've supplied it yourself, Kristian, when you look at the evidence, it surely does suggest that actually the right might be winning elections, but it's the left that's winning the heart and soul of the nation.
Yes, I think that's certainly what's happening. And you can have both of these phenomena at the same time. You can have, there were during the last before the last general election, there were lots of polls on individual policies that were associated with Corbyn, especially the whole thing about industry nationalizations, and that always turned out to be very popular. Not just among the usual suspects, but this had approval ratings of around 70% sometimes, in the same ballpark as the polling that we've just published. And it's just that, so if people voted exclusively on the basis of their policy preference on economic matters, then we would have a Corbyn government now, and it would be a very comfortable majority. It's just that elections are always, you vote for a package, you don't vote for someone or for a party exclusively on the basis of where you stand on this policy or that policy. It's a package of things, plus the impression that you have of personalities and parties, and that was the reason why Corbyn didn't win in the end. That he had low personal approval ratings, and especially among the older generations, he was really unpopular among baby boomers. But young people absolutely loved him. In the 2017 election, something like 2/3 of people under 40, I think, voted for him, and it was the turning point there was somewhere mid-40s. It was lower than that in 2019, but then that was again that's the package issue that I mentioned. That's because by then Brexit had become a much bigger factor than it was in 2017, and that was maybe the only thing at that time that could split the left progressive vote that drove a wedge through the what you could broadly call the Corbynite camp, and that's why it didn't work out for them. But short summary, I could absolutely imagine a revival of Corbynism. It doesn't have to come through the Labour Party. It doesn't even have to be any party. It could just be you can indeed win the argument even if you don't win elections. And I'd say we have, in recent years, we've had a good demonstration of that. And that's a topic which I know is close to your heart, which is Brexit. What happened there was that Euroscepticism was something that was never an election winner, in the sense that you never had a big Eurosceptic party in the House of Commons. It was never successful in that sense, but it just won the momentum and moved from being a fringe position to a mainstream position, and it then had real world consequences. And something like that could happen with anti-capitalism as well.
I mean, that is a really interesting point. I think then, I guess I actually voted in 2017, by the way, for one of Jeremy's candidates, because I was in Kate Hoey's constituency in Vauxhall, so I voted for her for Brexit. So I am one of Jeremy Corbyn's millennials, but in a sort of weird way for Brexit. I was trying to vote for Brexit. I don't think I'll ever vote Labour again, put it that way. So I buck the trend in many ways. But speaking of that trend, I sort of think, to conclude what we've discussed, again, we go back to that point. You've never struck me as one of life's optimists. In fact, I'm not one of life's optimists. You're quite conservative in that sense, Kristian. for a small L liberal. And I wonder, to what extent, I want you to sort of put the frighteners up us all. To what extent do you think we are doomed? What are we on the conservative or small L liberal side of things? What sort of future do we have to face here? Because, you know, you had Jeremy Corbyn for many, many years saying there is an alternative. You wrote a book on this. There is an alternative. It's called Venezuela. And everyone cheered. And everyone outside the public thought, pull the other one. Baby boomers would have said, pull the other one. Now, we see a whole generation that thinks, yeah, real socialism hasn't been tried. That old trope. So do you think we're all in store for the Venezuelan experience in the not too distant future then?
Okay, I am generally, as you say, a pessimist about political trends. That's right, but I nonetheless wouldn't go quite that far. I mean, nothing here is inevitable. To do something uncharacteristic for me, I'll say a few more positive things. What our polling also shows is that this attachment to socialism among millennials and Zoomers is quite a shallow one. So this is not, it's not that this is a generation of Marxist-Leninists. It's more that anti-capitalist, pro-socialist ideas are a sort of easy default opinion. In a lot of cases, I think people simply pick these response options because they will have heard them somewhere. This sounds familiar. This is something that you're surrounded with all the time if you are in that age group. And it's not necessarily that you have a strong commitment to that. In most cases, it isn't. And that's why we find a lot of contradictions also in our polling data. We also showed people some pro-capitalist statements on the same subjects. And we often find even though we have between 70 and 80% of people agreeing with the anti-capitalist statement, we then also have sometimes majorities agreeing with the pro-capitalist statement, often with two statements that are clearly mutually exclusive, where you cannot logically agree with both. A lot of people do agree with both and don't even notice the contradiction. And that suggests to me that this isn't firmly entrenched, this anti-capitalism. It is widespread. It's something that comes easily to a lot of people, but it's not something that's particularly well thought through. And it shows that a lot of people are not completely hostile to pro-market arguments. It's just that they probably just haven't come across them. But when you put it to them, they seem to think, oh, well, that sounds plausible too. And therefore, that could explain why you have people endorsing two contradictory statements. It's that both sound plausible to them. Individually, even if they are mutually exclusive. If this had been a qualitative survey, if this had been a focus group discussion, we would have followed up. I would have then told them, look, you just said capitalism is a terrible thing. You've now also said capitalism is actually quite okay. Don't you realize that you're contradicting yourself here? And then I would have tried to find out how people try to reconcile that contradiction. In that format, I couldn't do that. I can only speculate about the causes. My guess would be that it is the anti-capitalist opinion is the easy default opinion, but it's not a very strong commitment, and that might be overshadowed by other things. It doesn't mean that these people will automatically bring about the socialist revolution. So this could be the sort of thing that you say without caring strongly about it. It could be the equivalent of when somebody says, one day I'm going to write a novel, one day I'll write a marathon. The sort of thing that, yeah, sounds good, easy to say, but are you actually prepared to do something about it? That might be a different thing. And with socialism, it could be like that. But I nonetheless don't want to rely on that. And I think that's where the comparison with the EU referendum and with Brexit matters. Because you can have a capitalist economy without people who believe in capitalism. Because once you have it, it's just quite hard to change. But then that is precisely what supporters of Britain's EU membership would have said before 2016. They would have said, yes, we know that Britain is not a country of Europhiles. We know that this is not a country of people who are enthusiastic about the European project in the way that some of the core members, such as Belgium or Luxembourg, may be. We know that, but we nonetheless believe, that was the argument, we nonetheless believe that it doesn't matter because being anti-EU is something that people just say. It's just idle talk, and that you don't need a deep commitment, that you just have the status quo bias, and that would be enough to make sure that Britain will always be in the EU. And as we now know, that isn't how it turned out. And a capitalism without capitalists would be like an EU member without Europhiles. You could have the same situation. It might never matter, but it's just always unstable. And maybe to conclude, maybe that would be the take-home message, that people on the pro-market side, whether that's small L liberals or small C conservatives, or even centre-left social democrats, left-wingers who have made their peace with the market economy, we need to get better at making the case for capitalism at a more fundamental level. And that's something that we've forgotten how to do, because for such a long time it wasn't necessary. You said that when you were born, it wasn't. It would have been unusual for someone to say, "Haha, I'm literally a communist. Aren't I? Look how cool and edgy I am." And that's right. That didn't happen at the time, but one side effect of that, of the fact that the market economy just seemed accepted for a long time. One side effect of that is that people on the pro-market side have forgotten how to defend capitalism at that fundamental level, because you didn't need to do that. For quite a long time, there was just a presumption that most people accept a market economy of some sorts. And of course, there were always groups like the Socialist Workers' Party who did not, but you could safely ignore those. Those were not mainstream voices.
Fringe.
You would very rarely see someone from the Socialist Workers' Party on Politics Live or on Question Time. Now you see people with those views on there pretty much every day. Of course, not from that organization, because that would be considered crank left, but it's a difference in style. I mean, if you put someone from the Socialist Workers' Party or the Communist Party of Britain on a panel with people from Novara Media, it's not that they would disagree on any specific policies. It's just the difference would be in style, that the SWP, CPB people, they would sound like cranks, whereas the other guys would know how to make socialism sound cool. But that is really the only difference. And that is a big reason for what's a big factor in driving this revival of socialism.
I mean, fascinating stuff, Kristian. It really, really is. And I think any conservative politician, or as you said, any social democrat who sort of made their peace with the market economy, you know, the sort of Blairites of the world, you've got to get serious about this stuff, right? You've got to start to look at those surveys and think, well, yeah, you know, maybe Jezza's not going to have a breakaway party and have roaring success with it anytime soon. But socialism is winning the hearts and minds of the next generation. And that is a failure on the part of proponents of the market economy. So fascinating stuff. Kristian, if people want to find out more about your report, they can do so at iea.org.uk, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And your Twitter handle is
K_Niemietz, Niemietz. And there you can find everything, including my daily battles with commies of various shades.
Tankies, yes. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much, Kristian. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. That was a fascinating conversation. I'll put a link to Kristian's report in the survey in the description, and you can find out more about the IEA's work from there. Cheers. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.